chapters 20 through 22 of Holes. It felt good to walk in the shade of the 2 oak trees. Stanley wondered if this was how a condemned man felt on his way to the electric chair, appreciating all of the good things in life for the last time. They had to step around holes to get to the cabin door. Stanley was surprised to see so many around the cabin. He would have expected the warden to not want the campers digging so close to her home, but several holes were right up against the cabin wall. The holes were closer together here as well and were of different shapes and sizes. Mr. Sir knocked on the door. Stanley held the empty sack. "Yes," the warden said, opening the door. "There's been a little trouble on the lake," Mr. Sir said. "Caveman will tell you all about it." The warden stared at Mr. Sir a moment. Then her gaze turned toward Stanley. He felt nothing but dread now. "Come in, I suppose," said the warden. "You're letting the cold out." It was air-conditioned inside her cabin. The television was going. She picked up the remote and turned it off. She sat down on a canvas chair. She was barefoot and wearing shorts. Her legs were as freckled as her face and arms. "So what is it you have to tell me?" Stanley took a breath to steady himself. "While Mr. Sir was filling the canteens, I snuck into the truck and stole his sack of sunflower seeds." "I see." She turned to Mr. Sir. "That's why you brought him here?" she asked. "Yes, but I think he's lying. I think someone else stole the sack, and Caveman is covering up for X-ray or somebody. It was a 20-pound sack, and he claims to have eaten all of them by himself." He took the sack from Stanley and handed it to the warden. "I see," the warden said again. "The sack wasn't full," said Stanley, "and I spilled a lot. You can check my hole." "In that room, Caveman, there's a small flowered case. Will you get it for me, please?" She pointed to a door. Stanley looked at the door, then at the warden, then back at the door. He slowly walked toward it. It was a kind of dressing room with a sink and a mirror. Next to the sink, he saw a case with white with pink roses. He brought it back out to the warden, and she set it on the glass coffee table in front of her. She unclasped the latch and opened the case. It was a makeup case. Stanley's mother had one similar to it. He saw several bottles of nail polish, polish remover, a couple of lipstick tubes, and other jars and powders. The warden held up a small jar and a dark red nail polish. "You see this, Caveman?" He nodded. "This is my special nail polish. Do you see the dark, rich color? You can't buy that in a store. I have to make it myself." Stanley had no idea why she was showing it to him. He wondered why the warden would ever have the need to wear nail polish or makeup. "Do you want to know my secret ingredients?" He raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden opened the bottle. Rattlesnake venom. With a small paintbrush, she began applying it to the nails of her left hand. "It's perfectly harmless when it's dry." She finished her left hand. She waved in the air for a few seconds, then began painting the nails on her right hand. "It's only toxic while it's wet." She finished painting her nails and stood up. She reached over and touched Stanley's face with her fingers. She ran her sharp, wet nails very gently down his cheek. He felt his skin tingle. The nail of her pinky just barely touched the wound behind his ear. A sharp sting of pain caused him to jump back. The warden turned to face Mr. Sir, who was sitting on the fireplace hearth. "So you think he stole your sunflower seeds?" she asked. "No, he says he stole them, but I think it was..." She stepped toward him and struck him across the face. Mr. Sir stared at her. He had 3 long red marks slanting across the left side of his face. Stanley didn't know if it was redness that was caused by her nail polish or his blood. It took a moment for the venom to sink in. Suddenly, Mr. Sir screamed and clutched his face with both hands. He let himself fall over, rolling off the hearth and onto the rug. The warden spoke softly. "I don't especially care about your sunflower seeds." Mr. Sir moaned. "If you must know," said the warden, "I liked it better when you were still smoking." For a second, Mr. Sir's pain seemed to recede. He took several long, deep breaths. Then his head jerked violently, and he let out a shrill scream, worse than the one before. The warden turned to Stanley. "I suggest you go back to your holes now." Stanley started to go, but Mr. Sir lay in the way. Stanley could see the muscles on his face jump and twitch. His body writhed in agony. Stanley stepped carefully over him. "Is he—" "Excuse me," said the warden. Stanley was too frightened to speak. "He's not going to die," the warden said, "unfortunately for you." Chapter 21. It was a long walk back to his hole. Stanley looked out through the haze of heat and dirt at the other boys, lowering and raising their shovels. Group D was the farthest away. He realized that once again he would be digging long after everyone else had quit. He hoped he'd finished before Mr. Sir recovered. He didn't want to be out there alone with Mr. Sir. "He won't die," the warden had said, "unfortunately for you." Walking across the desolate wasteland, Stanley thought about his great-grandfather. Not the pig stealer, but the pig stealer's son. The one who was robbed by Kiss and Kate Barlow. He tried to imagine how he must have felt after Kiss and Kate had left him stranded in the desert. It probably wasn't a whole lot different from the way he himself felt now. Kate Barlow had left his great-grandfather to face the hot, barren desert. The warden had left Stanley to face Mr. Sir. Somehow his great-grandfather had survived for 17 days before he was rescued by a couple of rattlesnake hunters. He was insane when they found him. When he was asked how he had lived so long, he said he found refuge in God's thumb. He spent nearly a month in a hospital. He ended up marrying one of the nurses. Nobody ever knew what he meant by God's thumb, including himself. Stanley heard a twitching sound. He stopped in mid-step, with one foot still in the air. A rattlesnake lay coiled beneath his foot. Its tail was pointed upward, rattling. Stanley backed his leg away, then turned and ran. The rattlesnake didn't chase after him. It had rattled its tail to warn him to stay away. "Thanks for the warning," Stanley whispered as his heart pounded. The rattlesnake would be a lot more dangerous if it didn't have a rattle. "Hey, caveman," called Armpit. "You still alive?" "What'd the warden say?" asked X-Ray. "What'd you tell her?" asked Magnet. "I told her I stole the seeds," said Stanley. "Good going," said Magnet. "What'd she do?" asked Zigzag. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. "Nothing. She got mad at Mr. Sir for bothering her." He didn't feel like going into details. If he didn't talk about it, then maybe it didn't happen. He went over to his hole, and to his surprise, it was nearly finished. He stared at it, amazed. It didn't make any sense. Or perhaps it did. He smiled. Since he had taken the blame for the sunflower seeds, he realized the other boys had dug his hole for him. "Hey, thanks," he said. "Don't look at me," said X-Ray. Confused, Stanley looked around from Magnet to Armpit to Squid to Zigzag. None of them took credit for it. Then he turned to Zero, who had been quietly digging in his hole since Stanley's return. Zero's hole was smaller than all the others. Chapter 22. Stanley was the first one finished. He spat in his hole, then showered and changed into his cleaner set of clothes. It had been 3 days since the laundry was done, so even his clean set was dirty and smelly. Tomorrow these would become his work clothes, and his other set would be washed. He could think of no reason why Zero would dig his hole for him. Zero didn't even get any sunflower seeds. "I guess he likes to dig holes," Armpit had said. "He's a mole," Zigzag had said. "I think he eats dirt." "Moles don't eat dirt," X-Ray had pointed out. "Worms eat dirt." "Hey, Zero," Squid had asked. "Are you a mole or a worm?" Zero said nothing. Stanley never thanked him, but now he sat on his cot and waited for Zero to return from the shower room. "Thanks," he said as Zero entered through the tent flap. Zero glanced at him, then went over to the crates. where he deposited his dirty clothes and towel. "Why'd you help me?" Stanley asked. Zero turned around. "You didn't steal the sunflower seeds," he said. "So, neither did you," said Stanley. Zero stared at him. His eyes seemed to expand, and it was almost as if Zero were looking right through him. "You didn't steal the sneakers," he said. Stanley said nothing. He watched Zero walk out of the tent. If anybody had X-ray vision, it was Zero. "Wait," he called. Then he hurried after him. Zero had stopped just outside the tent, and Stanley almost ran into him. "I'll try to teach you to read if you want," Stanley offered. "I don't know if I know how to teach, but I'm not that worn out today since you dug my hole yesterday." A big smile spread across Zero's face. They returned to the tent, where they were less likely to be bothered. Stanley got his box of stationery and pen out of his crate. They sat on the ground. "Do you know the alphabet?" Stanley asked. For a second, he thought he saw a flash of defiance in Zero's eyes, but then it passed. "I think I know some of it," Zero said. "A, B, C, D." "Keep going," said Stanley. Zero's eyes looked upward. "E, F," said Stanley. "G," said Zero. He blew some air out of the side of his mouth. "H, I, K, P, H, I, J, K, L," said Stanley. "That's right," said Zero. I've heard it before. I just don't have it memorized exactly." "That's all right," said Stanley. "Here, I'll say the whole thing, just to kind of refresh your memory, and then you can try it." He recited the alphabet for Zero, then Zero repeated it without a single mistake. "Not bad for a kid who's never seen Sesame Street." "Well, I've heard it before somewhere," Zero said, trying to act like it was nothing, but his big smile gave him away. The next step was harder. Stanley had to figure out how to teach him to recognize each letter. He gave Zero a piece of paper and took a piece for himself. "I guess we'll start with A." He printed a capital A, and then Zero copied it on his sheet of paper. The paper wasn't lined, which made it more difficult, but Zero, his A wasn't bad, just a little big. Stanley told him he needed to write smaller, or he'd run out of paper really quick. Zero printed it smaller. "Actually, there are 2 ways to write each letter," Stanley said, and he realized this was going to be even harder than he thought. "That's a capital A, but usually you'll see a small a. You only have capitals at the beginning of a word, and only if it starts a sentence, or if it's a proper noun, like a name." Zero nodded as if he understood, but Stanley knew he was making very little sense. He printed a lowercase a, and Zero copied it. "So there are 52, said Zero. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. "Instead of 26, there are 52, said Zero. Stanley looked at him surprised. "I guess that's right. How'd you figure that out?" he asked. Zero said nothing. "Did you add?" Zero said nothing. "Did you multiply?" "That's just how many there are," said Zero. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. He didn't even know how Zero knew there were 26 in the first place. He didn't count them when he recited them. He had Zero write a few more uppercase and lowercase a's. Then he moved on to a capital B. This was going to take a long time, he realized. "You can teach me 10 letters a day," suggested Zero. 5 capitals and 5 smalls. After 5 days, I'll know them all. Except on the last day, I'll have to do 12. 6 capitals and 6 smalls. Again, Stanley stared at him, amazed that he was able to figure all that out. Zero must have thought he was staring for a different reason, because he said, "I'll dig part of your hole every day. I can dig for about an hour, then you can teach me for about an hour. And since I'm a faster digger anyway, our holes will get done about the same time. I won't have to wait for you." "Okay," Stanley agreed. As Zero was printing his B's, Stanley asked him how he figured out how it would take 5 days. "Did you multiply? Did you divide?" "That's just what it is," Zero said. "It's good math," said Stanley. "I'm not stupid," Zero said. "I know everybody thinks I am. I just don't like answering their questions." Later that night, as he lay on his cot, Stanley reconsidered the deal he had made with Zero. Getting a break every day would be a relief, but he knew X-ray wouldn't like it. He wondered if there might be some way Zero would agree to dig part of X-Ray's hole as well. But then again, why should he? I'm the one teaching Zero. I need the break so I'll have the energy to teach him. I'm the one who took the blame for the sunflower seeds, and I'm the one who Mr. Sir's mad at. He closed his eyes, and images of the warden's cabin floated inside his head. Her red fingernails, Mr. Sir writhing on the floor, her flowered makeup kit. He opened his eyes. He suddenly realized where he'd seen that gold tube before. He'd seen it in his mother's bathroom. He'd seen it again in the warden's cabin. It was half of a lipstick container. KB. KB. He felt a jolt of astonishment. His mouth silently formed the name, Kate Barlow. And he wondered if it really could have belonged to the Kissin' Outlaw. We'll find out more next time.